I want you to think back to when you were only 12 years old. You were probably excited about things like a half day at school or making the honor roll. And you were probably a lot like little David Hibbs. He was 12 years old when he stepped off his school bus on Friday, April 19th of 1991, clutching an honor roll certificate so tight it was wrinkling in his fist. Because he's already picturing his mom's face when he shows her. He's been picturing that moment in his head all day long. His mom smiling so proud of him. When he gets home from school that day, his mom's car is in the driveway of their home, and for half a second, everything feels normal. But that's when he sees it. Thick, black smoke pouring out from a vent beneath the bay window of their kitchen. His mom and his new puppy named Major were inside. He ran to the back door, he threw it open, and heat hit him so hard, it knocked him backwards. David immediately knew there was no way he could go inside. He ran to the front yard screaming for help so loud the neighbors came out of their homes and someone called 911. But it wasn't the fire that destroyed this family. It was a killer. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and if you've never been here before, I am Kimbyrleigha. It's nice to finally meet you. Now I have a deep dive for you today, and I just want to say somebody commented last week on one of my last videos and they said, girl, this is way too long, and I wanted to write back, oh, you must be new here because I used to do 3.5-hour videos and some of you missed that. Well, this is some of your favorite style videos from me. What I have always been known for, the deadly deep dives. And this one's going to frustrate you. It's going to leave you saying, why? Why? So many times. So let me take you back to April of 1991 to little David Hibbs. You know that feeling when you're a kid and you're carrying something into the house like it's a treasure? Like it's the one thing that's going to make your parents so proud that they're going to stop whatever they're doing and look at you and just like maybe stick it on the fridge the way our moms do. That was David Hibbs that Friday on April 19th. I told you that he was 12 years old. It was a half day at school that day, report card day. He already knew that he made the honor roll, and all day long, he had been holding on to this one thought. I can't wait to show my mom. I can't wait to see her smile. Because his mom, Joy, didn't do anything halfway. She wasn't the kind of parent who barely glanced up and said like, oh, cool. No, that was not her. She's the mom that we all dream of being. I know I do. The mom who celebrates. She made all the small stuff feel really big. And for a kid, that's so important. So when the school bus was rumbling down Spencer Drive, a little after 1 p.m., David could not contain his excitement. He stepped off the bus and started walking towards their modest ranch home that he lived in for most of his life, the Hibbs home in Croydon, Bristol Township in Pennsylvania. And the first thing he looks for without even thinking is his mom's car. And it's there. It's still in the driveway. She hadn't made it to work yet. And relief hit him so fast because he had been worried. He was thinking, what if she went on errands? What if she left for work? What if she missed the moment that he has been waiting for? But if he only knew what he would find inside that house. As he gets closer, something completely shifts. And David can't explain it. He doesn't know. Even years later, there's no right words for it. It was just this strange feeling. The air just felt different. It was almost like it was too still and there was a heaviness about it. Like the neighborhood was frozen in time and he was the only one moving. It was like he had some kind of mission that he wasn't even aware of, at least not yet. And then he rounded the corner of the side of his house, heading towards the kitchen window, and that's when he saw it. The thick, black smoke pouring out from a vent underneath their bay windows. This wasn't maybe something burned on the stove. This was dark, heavy smoke. It was the kind that you could feel in your throat just looking at it. And David's brain does that kid thing where you try to say that it's not real, like you're just imagining it, like closing your eyes and saying, nope, I'm not seeing this, it's a dream. But it wasn't. And when he realized the house was on fire and that his mom's car was in the driveway, that could only mean one thing, that she was still inside. David goes into panic mode. So fast, his body was moving before his thoughts even caught up. He sprinted to the back of the house. He grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and the house just expelled smoke. It billowed out so fast and so hot and thick. Just this blast of smoke and blistering heat exploded outward, like the house was just spinning it out onto him. He had the breath knocked out of him. He couldn't see, and it knocked him backwards so hard he almost fell to the floor. And then he sees a flash of fur. The new puppy races out through the door and bolts into the yard. David barely even noticed. Because inside that doorway, he can see flames climbing, crawling up the walls like they're alive, but he doesn't think anyone else could be if they were inside. He knows his mom had to be. She was home, so he calls out her name, watching like everything's happening in slow motion. Even at 12, he understands immediately. I can't go in there. I can't get to her. The fire is too hot. It's too fast, too much. So he runs. He runs for the front of the house, into the street, and starts screaming for help. He yells loudly, "Help! My house is on fire. My mom is inside. Help!" And neighbors pour out of their homes. People who were making lunch, folding laundry, doing ordinary Friday things, and they freeze when they see what David is seeing. Someone runs for the phone and calls 911, and David is frantic. He's inconsolable. He's trying to launch himself back towards that doorway. A neighbor has to physically restrain him, and David kicks and punches and thrashes around screaming, trying to break free because he knew his mom was inside. His mom was supposed to be in there. Her car was still there. And when the medics arrive, they realize David is a danger to himself. They guide him to the back of the ambulance, trying to block his view, trying to keep him from sprinting to that fire again. David later says that time felt warped, like he was not truly in his own body, like he was watching his life happen from somewhere outside of it. And he sits in that ambulance shaking, and it feels like forever. And while Spencer Drive now fills with sirens and flashing lights, the news reaches Charlie Hibbs, Joy's husband. He was working his construction job in downtown Philadelphia, about 20 miles away, when one of his coworkers rushes in. He's pale and he's out of breath, and he blurts out, "Charlie, your house is on fire." Charlie doesn't even stop to ask questions. He runs to his truck and drives home as fast as he can. His whole world is on Spencer Drive. And back at the house, the firefighters crawl inside on their hands and knees through heat and smoke so thick it turns these rooms into literally black caves. They push deeper, room by room, until they reach David's bedroom. And there on the floor, they find a body. Burned, still, and unrecognizable at first glance. And sadly, they had just found Joy Hibbs. Outside, David was still clutching that honor roll certificate, still waiting for the moment where his mom smiled and tells him how proud she is. He doesn't know yet that the house he walked into wasn't just a house fire. It was a crime scene, and the fight for the truth would take 33 years. So now you know why this is a deep dive. We have a lot to get to, but if you know my style, when I do a deep dive or when I talk about a story like this, I like to start with who the victim was. Before Spencer Drive became a blocked-off street full of flashing lights and neighbors whispering on their porches, it was a normal place. The kind of working-class neighborhood where kids disappeared into their backyards after school and came home when a parent yelled their name. The kind of street where people wave from their driveways, where you recognize the cars that belong there, and where safe felt like something you didn't even have to think about. And the reason Joy Hibbs fits into that kind of neighborhood so perfectly is because Joy was built for it. She was built for community, built for family. That is just who Joy was. Joy Ann Avil was born September 23rd of 1955 to her father Albert, who went by Sam, and her mother Tommy Jane in Ocala, Florida. She was the youngest of 9 children, which meant she grew up in a home filled with noise and voices overlapping and people moving around in a household that never felt empty or quiet. And if you're wondering the names of all 8 of her siblings, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find every one of them, but she did have a brother, Clarence, another one named George, and there was Thomas and a sister, Susan, among the 9. Just the fact that she was in such a big household, that's the kind of childhood that shapes you. And what I mean by that is it teaches you things like how to read a room, how to smooth things over, how to show up for people without even being asked, because you have such a mixture of personalities right from the beginning. Joy carried that natural Southern warmth from the start, the type of warmth that doesn't feel like she's putting on a performance. It's just there because it's genuine, and people gravitated towards her, and her name suited her. Being around Joy felt like taking in a breath of fresh air. She was kind, loving, and she liked to have fun. She also had a competitive side, mostly when it came to track and field, and she excelled at it. She loved animals. She always had a pet, and usually more than one. If it was a cat or a dog, her favorite was a dog. She would have at least 2 at all times. and there seemed to always be one by her side. That didn't change as she grew up, but it was in high school that she found another love. Joy met the person who would reshape her entire life, a blue-eyed boy named Charlie Hibbs, and their connection formed very quickly. And by Joy's senior year, they were inseparable. And then Joy learned that she was pregnant, which in that era and in their families didn't feel like, oh, we're going to just figure it out. It wasn't that type of situation. Both families were rooted in tradition and expectations, and everyone agreed there was only one path forward: to get married. So shortly after graduation, Joy and Charlie did get married. They had a simple but very beautiful celebration. The couple was both in white, Joy with her hair pulled back up with half of it like in a big bouffant or a beehive with lots of volume. Her dress was pretty non-traditional for the time. It was short and cute and collared, almost like with crocheted sleeves on it, tiny little cutouts, and I liked it a lot. And Charlie's tux with its baby blue on it matched his eyes, and they looked so happy. And they actually were so happy. The newlyweds drove away smiling as the photographer captured that joyful moment. They were young, though, and they were stepping into adulthood very fast, into responsibilities that most people ease into very slowly, but they were determined to build a life anyway, and one that they would be proud of. 9 months later, on January 3rd of 1975, their daughter Angie was born. And 4 years after that, on September 30th of 1978, their son David arrived. And from the very moment that Joy held her children, she found something that looked like a purpose to her. Motherhood wasn't a role she just carried out. It was something that she became instinctively so attached to because it felt so right. She wasn't just raising a family. She was the anchor, holding everything in place. It made sense that Joy would be an amazing mother with the way that she loved and cared for animals. It was built into who she was. Joy was the kind of mom who didn't just do birthdays casually. If a birthday was coming up, she didn't just circle it on a calendar. She planned every detail. She made sure her kids felt celebrated and seen. And if the school needed a volunteer, a classroom helper, a parent to attend a meeting, Joy would raise her hand before anybody else. And she did not complain. She didn't even look for recognition. It was just who she was. She was fun-loving, almost like a kid at heart, so it was really easy to be the mom who showed up because she actually enjoyed it. She also loved food, and cooking was fun too. But eating was even better, and her family said that food was one of her many love languages, and that some of her favorite dishes included pecan pie, potato salad, and fried okra. She also loved watching sports. She was a big football fan. On Monday nights, you could find her in front of the TV cheering on the Miami Dolphins or the Dallas Cowboys. And the way her children attached to her told you everything you needed to know. David openly called himself a mama's boy, and it was like a badge of honor for him. Some of his earliest memories were of clinging to the hem of Joy's nightgown as she moved from room to room, like if he lost sight of her even for a second, his world would fall apart. He followed her like a shadow, always just one step behind, soaking up every moment he could with his mom. And Joy, of course, she never pushed him away. She adored that he wanted to be close to her, and she made sure he always felt safe, wanted, and deeply loved. Angie had the same type of bond with Joy, just shaped differently as she got older. And as Angie moved into her teenage years, the relationship between her and her mom shifted into something more that looked like a real friendship. Joy was the person that she confided in, whether it was school stress, friend drama, boys, the future. Joy was the one that Angie could talk to about anything. And from the outside, Joy looked like she stepped right out of an old-fashioned TV show. Soft-spoken, nurturing, always put together. I mean, she definitely had natural beauty, and eventually she stopped wearing makeup altogether because she really didn't need it. She kept her signature teased 80s hairstyle, though, perfectly in place, hairsprayed just the way she liked it, and that became one of her signature looks. Charlie had a very different vibe. They were like opposites. Long, shaggy hair, thick beard, worn-in jeans. He loved motorcycles and dirt bikes. And Joy actually did like to ride with him too. But to strangers, he might have looked intimidating. However, underneath that rugged exterior was a very hardworking man who was a general contractor who actually enjoyed calm things too. Fishing early in the morning, tinkering in the garage. And fishing was that one thing he would drop everything for, but not because he wanted to do it. It was because that was Joy's favorite hobby. And if she said, "We're going fishing that day," that was what they were doing. And she loved it. Charlie was an introvert. And even though they looked like opposites, Joy and Charlie were compatible in so many ways, all the ways that really matter. They shared that love for the outdoors, and Joy could spend hours in the garden. Charlie would often say that Joy was a country girl at heart, and he loved that about her. So that's why anytime she said she wanted to go fish, he would jump at the opportunity. If she wanted to dig in the dirt or plant flowers, he would join her. Their best family trips were the ones spent camping under open skies, making s'mores over the fire, with their dogs in the back of the truck bed not left behind. They were part of the family. Where the Hibbs went, their pets went. Joy actually spent time working as a vet tech, but her dream was to become a medical assistant. She truly loved people and wanted to help. This family was very close, if you haven't noticed. They did almost everything together. If Charlie needed lumber for a job, Joy would go with him and keep him company. On weekends, they wandered around flea markets, browsing old tools and antiques. And in the summer, they would hop on their motorcycles and ride to the rest stop off I-95 just to sit and be together. For Joy, it was really the simple things that brought her the most happiness, even just listening to music, especially, like I said, country and rock and roll. She loved Van Halen, the Rolling Stones, Van Morrison, Kenny Rogers, and Bryan Adams. To Angie and David, of course, their parents weren't perfect, but they knew they were good partners. Joy was the calm center of the family, and Charlie worked really hard to keep her at the center of that. Their bond shaped that entire household. But for a long time, their home was not in one permanent place. When the kids were little, Joy and Charlie moved wherever the work took them. They started in Florida, then to Texas, and then to Washington State. And each move was another attempt at stability, another try at giving their kids something better. In Washington, Charlie finally hit a really good stretch of good luck. Construction work was steady, the pay was really good, and it started to feel like they might have found their place. Then Mount St. Helens erupted, and everything changed. Communities were actually devastated. Businesses shut down. The jobs were nowhere. They practically dried up overnight. With no work and 2 kids to support, Joy and Charlie made another big decision. They had to relocate closer to family. They moved across the country again, and this time to Northeast Pennsylvania, where Charlie's mom and stepfather lived. Charlie's plan was to join his stepfather's construction business, and Joy was determined to build a life she could be proud of. She wanted to work hard to go back to school and become a certified medical assistant. And she did. And she quickly found a job almost immediately. It was at a family practice in the area. This was something she always wanted. And finally, after years of moving, they landed somewhere that felt permanent to them. By 1986, the Hibbs family had enough money saved. They were able to buy a modest 3-bedroom ranch-style home for only $42,000. I mean, I'm saying only because of how you could not get a house like that at all for that price now. But there it was, on Spencer Drive in Croydon, Bristol Township, Pennsylvania, a quiet street of neatly kept lawns and families who waved from their porches, a true working-class neighborhood. And for the Hibbs family, it was everything that they had been searching for. They were so happy. I mean, this was a huge milestone for this entire family. This house was their house. It meant so much to them. And the house was cute. It was very charming. It had these little bay windows looking out from the kitchen, a backyard for the kids and pets to play in, and their own driveway. It was perfect. Angie and David made friends immediately, playing tag, riding bikes, just disappearing into neighbors' yards after school and returning home when the streetlights came on or when Joy would call them in for dinner. David, being young and carefree, was actually the one that would go riding his bike all around the neighborhood and introducing himself to the neighbors. And then he'd tell them about his mom and dad and bring them over to say hello. And soon, everyone on their street knew who the Hibbs were. Joy and Charlie blended in quickly. They would chat over fences. They would help out when someone needed an extra hand, settling in to this comfortable community where people genuinely looked out for one another. And that's one thing about Joy. They weren't just living in this home. Joy made it into their home. She was so good at making people feel like nothing would ever fall apart as long as she was there, which is why what happened next hits the way that it does. Because when you're the person that is at the center of your family, nobody ever truly believes that anything will happen to you and that you could just be taken away. But now we have to go back to April of 1991, when the Hibbs' lives changed forever. Just days earlier, in mid-April, Joy and her husband, Charlie, they were doing something very simple. They went out to dinner together to celebrate another year of marriage. And after the meal, they drove home with the windows cracked and the radio turned up, and they were singing along to their favorite songs. And it was one of those nights that makes you forget the struggles you've had. Even only if it's for a couple hours, the kids, Angie and David, they had been away that weekend, which meant that the house was quiet. And it was just the two of them. And those moments were rare, and they were just really sweet after years of raising kids and rebuilding their lives across multiple states. Charlie would say later that that night was really wonderful. It was one of the last carefree memories he had of him and his wife's life together. And then came April 19th. That's where we left off in the beginning, but now with a lot more detail so you can really understand what that day looked like for this family. It started like any other weekday morning inside the Hibbs home. Charlie woke up before sunrise. He was getting ready for another long construction day. And before he walked out that door, he did something small that only feels important later. He carried the family's new puppy, a tiny black lab, a big ball of energy and softness, into the bedroom and gently set it beside Joy. And then he woke up David because he knew that David loved to climb into bed with his mom and snuggle with their puppy before getting on the bus to school. It was their little ritual, the kind of thing kids build their whole sense of safety and security around without even realizing it. It was his constant. It happened every day. Angie, who was 16, was in her own morning chaos. Hairspray, books, trying not to miss the bus as she darted out the door with just a quick goodbye. Moments later, David grabbed his backpack and headed out as well. For David, this wasn't just any Friday, it was report card day, and even better, it was a half day. He was getting out at noon, and he already knew he made the honor roll, and he was so proud of it. But of course, the real prize wasn't his name on a list or even the certificate. It was going to be Joy's reaction. She celebrated everything, big things, small things, it didn't matter. And David couldn't wait to walk through the front door and see her face when he showed her what he had earned. And back inside, Joy was doing her morning routine like she always did. Coffee at the kitchen table, maybe 2 cups if she was tired that morning, a few words to her kids as they rushed around gathering their shoes and their homework, and the house was slowly emptying out as her day began. And after the house settled down into silence, nothing about Joy's morning seemed unusual at all. Nothing warned her that this would be the last day of her life. She planned to leave for work later that day around 2 p.m. Now, she worked for the doctor in the area from 8 to 2:30 p.m. during the week, but 2 days every week, one of them being Fridays, the office was open late. So Joy would actually start at 2 p.m. and end at 8 p.m. She would go do her errands that day, go to the grocery store, and then go to work. So a little after 1 p.m., that is when David's bus came down Spencer Drive and stopped right in front of their house. He stepped off, clutching that honor roll certificate, and that's when he noticed his mother's maroon Mercury Cougar in their driveway. And all the while, on the way to the house, he kept wondering, would she still be home when he arrived, or whether she would already be at work or running errands, and he would miss the chance to walk in that house and show off his accomplishments. And that's when he noticed the smoke. And he ran to the backyard to avoid that area and try to go inside the back door. And I can only imagine how horrific it was to see that this home that they loved was burning to the ground, flames shooting out from inside, and he was in a panic. The smoke was so thick, he couldn't even see inside. He hardly noticed that the black little puppy ran out the door under his feet. His eyes were fixated on the stove. It looked like there were flames coming off the top where the burners were. Now, he was in total shock. I can't even imagine that fear, but instead of standing there frozen, he ran to the street. He screamed for help. And that is when Barbara Baker, she's in her front yard, she hears his screams, and she tells another neighbor to go call 911 for help. Barbara was the one that literally had to pin David against a palm tree in her yard because he was trying to run back inside to save his mother. And finally, she couldn't hold him any longer because he was punching her in the chest. And that's because he was so frantic. He wanted to break free so badly. Another neighbor had to put him in a bear hug until the authorities arrived unseen. David would later say that those minutes actually felt surreal. Like he wasn't even there. Like time just stretched into something endless. Those were his words. And he felt like it was just forever when medics finally got there. And that's when they realized the danger he would have had running into those flames. So that's when they put him in the back of the ambulance, trying to keep him safe and calm him down, and also to shield him from what he could be seeing, because that house was starting to burn to the ground. David's father was already on the way, literally stopped what he was doing at work on his construction job when he heard one of his employees screaming that the house was on fire. He got there as fast as he could, and 16-year-old Angie would be getting off her school bus around 2:30, so it wouldn't be long before she was also on the scene. But while still at school, she was actually hearing vague talk about a fire somewhere in their neighborhood, but nothing about it sounded personal at all. Her mind went to something really normal: her prom dress, the one that her and her mom had bought recently. She wondered if the fire, wherever it was in the neighborhood, might have damaged her dress. It didn't even cross her mind that her mother could be inside that smoke, that it could be their house on fire. And it might sound weird, but I think it's completely normal for a teenager to think about her prom dress. It's not even irrational for her to think if a house was down the street and on fire, that would somehow reach her dress, but maybe she thought that so many different houses would be affected. But unfortunately, the truth was so much worse. And when Charlie arrived, the first thing was they wouldn't let him anywhere near his own home. He was watching firefighters dousing out this fire with their hoses, and he was just staring in shock because there was nothing he could do. And that's when he sees them pushing a stretcher out of his house. Even through the smoke and at a distance, he knew, before his brain could even catch up, that that was his wife, and his knees gave out. He staggered towards his truck for balance, and he began sobbing. He was crying and could hardly contain himself. David was watching from the ambulance, and he said he had never seen his father cry like that before in his life. Seeing him break down was terrifying. The parents are always the ones that we suck it up, we hold it together, we don't want our kids to know. But if there's a moment like that that's completely tragic, you cannot contain it. Angie gets there around this time, and as her bus pulls up, she can't believe what she's seeing. The street looked like a disaster scene. There were fire trucks lined up the block, police were moving in and out across lawns, medics were carrying equipment back and forth, and there were neighbors just standing in clusters, whispering and pointing and just watching. And there was smoke just hanging in the air. As she stepped off that bus, Angie couldn't find anyone. She didn't know where her father was. She couldn't find her mom or her brother. She was in a panic. And there she was in the street, just scanning the crowd for a face that she knew was familiar until she saw the ambulance. And in the back, the doors were open, and inside she saw David. He was hunched forward, his shoulders were trembling, and he was clutching their little puppy to his chest. A medic had actually found the dog, handed it to him to try to give him something to hold on to because he was crying and he was so panicked. And for 1 second, Angie felt relieved. She was like, oh, good. The puppy was saved. Her mind didn't even go to her mother being inside. She thought maybe her mom was nearby, maybe she was talking to the police, maybe Angie just hadn't found her yet. But as she reached the ambulance, she overheard what someone was telling David. Soft voices, careful words, and she saw her brother shake his head, refusing to believe it. He kept saying, no, you're wrong. And she heard someone say it. Just matter-of-factly, she didn't make it. I'm personally terrified, absolutely terrified by fire. It's one of the scariest things for me. I think it's just so powerful, so devastating and unforgiving. And Angie couldn't believe that her mom was gone, dead, that she was never coming back because she knew what it meant, that she didn't make it. And I was thinking to myself, it must happen so quickly. When it says that your mind can't catch up, I can imagine what that's like when you're just sitting there in shock. She said to herself, how did the dog get out? And my mom didn't. How was that possible? And that night, Charlie took Angie and David to his parents' home, and the three of them just held on to each other. They barely spoke. They just cried. Words meant nothing at this point. There was nothing to say. And I feel like that so many times when I try to give condolences, there just aren't any words. David was shaking. He was still at one moment, and then he would panic because the realization would come back into his mind that his mom was never coming back. The first responders had told the family that Joy had been found in his bedroom, and then he had this guilt. It just kept gnawing at him. He thought, was there something in my room that started the fire? Was it my computer? Did she run in to see something? Was it my aquarium light left on? Did something spark this? And his mom stepped in there and she died. I mean, thinking about that as a 12-year-old, it would be devastating. You'd feel so much guilt. And by morning, Joy's husband, Charlie, he could not just sit still anymore. He drove back to Spencer Drive and he saw the house with its blackened shell. The windows had been shattered and now they were boarded up. The siding was scorched. The roof line was warped. Personal items were all over the lawn as they were examined. Things that were once so meaningful to this family were now blackened with soot. Whole bed frames were charred. Mattresses were non-existent except for the springs. And smoke was still clinging to the air. Yellow tape cut across the property, keeping outsiders out. And there was toxic material inside. But there was also bodily fluids, remnants of a human being. It wasn't a place that anyone should have been. But Charlie, he tried to step past it, to go inside, to see where his wife had been. But officers stopped him. The property, they told him, was an active death investigation, and no one, not even Joy's husband, was allowed inside. Now, anytime a fire occurs where a death happens, and you probably know this, the fire marshal actually has to come out there as part of the death investigation. They want to pinpoint how this fire started. And this is important for so many reasons. For one, they want to know if something was recalled, if it was an appliance that wasn't working properly and it malfunctioned, if there was some kind of electrical device that sparked and caught fire. So it's crucial for them to know so they can save others' lives if that's the case. And inside, the fire marshal moved through the ruins of this house, noting every single detail. This was not a complete loss, meaning there were things in this house that did not burn to the ground. There were things that were intact, mostly because David had come home early from school and alerted the neighbors so fast. When the fire marshal got into David's bedroom, he knew this was where Joy was found. It was nearly annihilated. He estimated that the heat was around 1,000 degrees at the height of the blaze. And in the debris, he found a partially melted clock that stopped at exactly 12:54 p.m. This suggested that that is when the fire began around that time, which would mean that was minutes before David stepped off that bus. That is so sad. But you'll come to find out there's nothing he could have done to save his mother anyway. And then came the kitchen. All 4 of the stove burners had been on when firefighters arrived. David thought that's what he caught a glimpse of when he was looking through the door. And the fire marshal determined combustibles were definitely placed on top. There was a garbage can that had clearly been set on fire. And then back in David's room, they found magazines and books that had been burned, almost like they were kindling material right near his bed. And from the evidence, it was determined, according to the positioning of Joy's body, that she was actually on her son's bed when she died. As the fire marshal continued through the house, he identified 4 separate areas where fires had been started. So that's key here. There were burn patterns showing there were individual ignition points of this fire. And at least one of those locations was inside David's bedroom. And inside, there was what appeared to have been a suspected accelerant. So I think you probably knew that this case was not going to be just an arson case and that it definitely doesn't fit an accident. By the time the fire marshal stepped back and looked at the whole picture, the conclusion was no longer just a possibility. It was the only thing that fit what happened here. This fire had been set on purpose. It was arson. But who would do such a thing? Would Joy? Now, it had to be ruled out. It's sad to even think about it, that you have to go there when you have this grieving family and everything, that they're waiting to hear what happened to their loved one. They don't want to think that maybe their own loved one caused this to themselves. They didn't even want to imagine that. But investigators had to. The next step was the autopsy. Because if Joy died in the fire, investigators had to understand how. Forensic pathologist Dr. Halbert Fillinger completed the examination. But the moment he examined her airway, Joy's cause of death shifted right away because there was no soot, no smoke particles, and no sign that Joy had been breathing during that fire. That meant she didn't die because of the smoke or the flames. She was already dead before the fire even began. This is a classic cover-up. A killer believing that fire is going to get rid of everything, even evidence of their crime. A crime to cover another crime, and that hardly works. And as the examination continued, the violence was undeniable. Joy had suffered a severe beating, blunt force trauma to her body so severe her rib cage was crushed. She had been stabbed 5 times in the neck and chest, and there was evidence of strangulation. There was a melted and burned cord wrapped around the upper portion of her body, and it was determined to be a computer cord. However, there was no evidence of her being sexually violated, and the medical examiner ruled this entire situation as a homicide. And that's when everything changed from a death investigation to a murder investigation. I mean, it's kind of clear with stab wounds and blunt force trauma. The coroner, though, made a public statement. He said that the wounds were definitely not self-inflicted. She wasn't killed in a fire, she was murdered. And the question on Spencer Drive now wasn't how a house caught on fire. It was this. If someone could kill Joy Hibbs inside her home sometime late that morning before 12:54 p.m., who walked in? And how did they walk back out of that house without being seen in the middle of broad daylight? Because this neighborhood was one of those neighborhoods where everyone was watching. You cared about who came and went because this was your safe place. But Spencer Drive wasn't safe. Not anymore. And now detectives had to treat the Hibbs home like what it actually was. Not the site of a fire, but the site of a violent killing that someone had tried to erase. They returned to the blackened shell of this ranch home on Spencer Drive with a different kind of focus now, stepping carefully over charred beams and melted debris, trying to reconstruct a sequence of events that the fire had worked over time to destroy. The problem, though, was obvious. The second you looked around, fire doesn't just burn furniture, it burns the timeline because it burns fingerprints, it burns every little subtle clue that investigators usually rely on. Trace evidence, fibers, blood patterns, anything delicate enough that would tell a story. And then the water that firefighters use to put the fire out washes everything away. This is powerful. So whatever the flames didn't consume, the fire also erased. There were still some things, though, that stood out. One was that they did not note any forced entry to the house. The doors weren't splintered, the frames were not smashed, the locks did not look tampered with. There was no obvious sign that, let's say, someone kicked their way inside. And that detail mattered because it immediately forces a question that nobody wants to really ask out loud. Did Joy know her killer? Did she willingly open the door? Did she trust them? Or maybe at least she didn't see them as a threat. So as the detectives move deeper into the house, they make another discovery. In the living room, wedged in between burned cushions of the couch, was Joy's wallet, completely empty. Her purse was in the kitchen, it was opened, and the contents were spilled out. Now, this doesn't automatically mean a robbery took place because you have a case where high-powered hoses could have moved things, knocked over a purse. We don't know that. I mean, we don't know what happened to the contents of her purse or her wallet. But if things were taken, then it could explain why she had possibly been targeted in the first place. Then they went into the room where everything had been the hottest, David's bedroom, the room where firefighters had found Joy's body. And inside, they found the remnants of a burned electrical cord, blackened and curled from the heat, and with the medical examiner confirming there was strangulation, and there was also a burned piece of cord that was wrapped around Joy's body, they realized that this cord, whatever was left of it, was most likely what was used during the attack. Now, the idea that a common household item like a cord could have been used as a weapon made this scene feel more personal, for one thing. It was like the killer, obviously didn't come prepared with one single tool and then leave. They used what was there. And also that this could have happened really fast. Like maybe they didn't come there with the intention for this to happen this way, but they didn't know. Now, in the kitchen, investigators took note of the knives that survived the fire. Some of them were warped. They were partially, burned and melted down, but none of them matched the stab wounds that the medical examiner documented, which meant that the knife used to kill Joy wasn't, hidden in a drawer somewhere waiting to be found. It had not been in the house when the fire was started. It was gone. It was taken, probably disposed of. And now another moment that a lot of investigators dread. They had to sit down with Charlie Hibbs and tell him what the autopsy showed, what all the evidence leaned to. Until then, Charlie had been trapped in this nightmare, the belief that his wife had just died being trapped in a fire. That's already so devastating. But then, can you imagine being told that someone you love not only suffered, but it was brutal, that they had been murdered. That was even worse because now he was thinking of everything she had been through. I guess there's one positive, and it's not even that, but obviously knowing that she did not die in that fire, that she was already dead before the fire started. But Charlie's in complete shock. He doesn't understand. He was like, how could she be strangled and stabbed? When he told his children that they didn't just lose their mother, but that she had been murdered, they just lost all sense of reality. Angie had already been drowning in disbelief since she heard that her mom didn't make it. But hearing that someone had done this to her mom deliberately inside their own home, to her, that was so personal. And for David at 12 years old, his reaction was pure fear. He kept thinking, what's stopping this killer from coming back? Was he watching them right now? Was he waiting? Were they next? He started sleeping with the lights on. He would keep checking the doors. And at night, he had to be close to his father because he couldn't be all by himself. So he slept with his dad. And Charlie, of course, was trying to make sense of everything. He was trying to put the pieces together, trying to think of who would want to hurt his wife. And one thing he kept coming back to was Joy herself. She was strong. She was athletic. She wasn't the type of woman to freeze and let something happen without fighting back. If someone attacked her, Charlie believed that she would have struggled hard. And that only circled him right back to the detail that detectives already couldn't ignore. No forced entry. If Joy opened the door, why? So that's where they really wanted to start. And you hear this every time. The ripple effects through this neighborhood could be felt everywhere. Neighbors were double checking their locks. The parents were not letting their kids stay out. Everything was different now. There was a killer on the loose. So the illusion that this was the kind of place where nothing like this happened, that was gone. The detectives, though, knew that this neighborhood would probably be some of the best witnesses because I told you, people were watching all the time. So someone had to have seen something on Spencer Drive. This wasn't some isolated property tucked behind acres of land. These homes were sitting close together. I'm showing it on the screen. I mean, this is a neighborhood now, but only 12 to 15 feet apart. The kind of street like that where you hear a screen door slam, a dog bark, someone yelling from their yard. And on a warm spring day, people were all out and about with their windows open. They were outside. If something unusual was happening, there was a good chance someone noticed, even if they didn't understand what it was at the time. So, of course, detectives do what they always do. They go door to door. They're trying to collect all the normal details, talking about people's day, anything you saw or heard. And residents told them there was a lot of activity that morning. Some mentioned even seeing a man who worked for the sanitation department going to the back of the Hibbs property, and that stood out. Others noticed that their mail carrier they usually had, the regular person, wasn't there. So someone else was on their route. Detectives followed up. They questioned the sanitation worker. They tracked down the temporary mail carrier, but nothing was connected to what happened. They even went to all the places that Joy went on her errands, and one by one, all these promising leads, these potential tips, fizzled. Nothing concrete came out of it. Nothing explained why Joy, why that house, and why that day. So detectives did what they always do next. They started building a timeline of Joy's final moments minute by minute. They learned that she began her day at a local bank where she deposited Charlie's paycheck, and then she also cashed her own from the doctor's office. It was a $70 check, and records showed she left the bank at 9:53 a.m., and from there, she went to a grocery store, picked up some items, and checked out at 10:54 a.m. Around 11 o'clock, neighbors saw her back at home walking the puppy outside, and that was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. But then, somewhat of a lead. Detectives find out someone visited the Hibbs home that morning. Instantly, that piqued their interest. Not because it sounded sinister right away, but because it was one of the only confirmed points where a stranger or a near stranger could have crossed Joy's path. Apparently, around 11:30 a.m., two men from a local Baptist church had stopped by, Reverend Orlando and his associate. The Hibbs family wasn't even religious, but Joy had a coworker who went to that church, and a few weeks earlier, Joy had gone with her for an Easter service, and she filled out one of those cards that said she was open to a church visit. It's just odd that it was on that day, on the day that she's murdered. Detectives brought Reverend Orlando in and questioned him carefully, and Orlando explained that he and his associate did go visit Joy's house to talk about her spiritual life and to invite her more formally into their church. He said at one point, he asked her directly, and now it's a very eerie question, if you died today, do you know for certain that you would go to heaven? And he told detectives that Joy got really emotional and she cried as they prayed together in the living room. Now, he believed those were tears of joy. I mean, that's kind of a pun since her name is Joy, I get it. But he said tears of joy. It was a sign in his perspective that she felt spiritually saved in that moment. And wow. I mean, what are the chances? It's comforting to those who believe in that type of salvation, but Joy died soon after this, and that seemed too coincidental. Not that a person from the church was to blame, but it just stood out. Reverend Orlando told detectives that he and his associate left the house roughly 10 minutes before noon. He said at that point he went to eat lunch with his wife, and he left for another scheduled visit. And his wife confirmed that timeline. And they were also able to confirm his associate's timeline as well. With those confirmations, detectives concluded it was not probable that these church visitors could have left, returned, committed such an extreme violent act, set multiple fires throughout this house, and vanished without anyone on Spencer Drive noticing. So that lead, one of the few that seemed real in the early hours, was closed. They did not move forward. But their confirmed timeline now created something that detectives could work with. If Joy was last seen around 11 a.m., and if the church visitors left just before 12 p.m., and if the partially melted clock in David's bedroom stopped at 12:54 p.m., the approximate time of the fire starting, then the window for Joy's death narrowed down to about 11:50 a.m. to 12:50 p.m., just 1 hour. Think about that. If she had been anywhere else but at her home, maybe she would still be alive. Or maybe her death would have just been delayed because possibly she had been targeted. Maybe somebody was watching or stalking her. They didn't know. And that's when the neighborhood started offering details that felt less like background noise and more like a real potential lead, because multiple neighbors reported seeing a dark blue 1980s era Chevy Monte Carlo parked right outside the Hibbs home that day. And it wasn't parked cleanly, like someone was visiting politely. No. It was parked really oddly. It was sitting about 3 feet from the curb, almost like the driver pulled up quickly, didn't even bother straightening the car out, like they were on a mission, one where they would have been in and out of Joy's house quickly. One neighbor remembered that it was around 12:30, and another noticed that it was gone by 1 p.m. And no one even got a license plate because, of course, in that moment, no one knew it was going to matter. But the problem was, for detectives anyway, Monte Carlos were very common. I mean, everyone was buying a Monte Carlo. Everyone was driving one. The fact, though, that there was more than one neighbor noticing the same car, enough to remember its color, the model, the weird parking, that made it harder to dismiss. So detectives started going wider. They were running plates. They were trying to narrow down if anyone had a blue Monte Carlo around. But while that is happening, they're getting more and more of an impression that there's no point of this because, like I said, so many people had this car. It was so common. So they go back to what they did have: Joy's timeline, the murder window, the lack of forced entry into the home, the empty wallet, and of course, they write down a dark blue Monte Carlo. They thought their best bet was actually to ask Charlie himself, do you know anyone who drove a car like this? Because it was parked at his house. So did they have a friend with this kind of car, or did they know an acquaintance with this kind of car? And Charlie doesn't even hesitate. He had an answer right away. He told them, yeah, I do know someone who drives a Monte Carlo. And the second that name entered this conversation, the investigation stopped feeling like a bunch of random possibilities, and it actually started feeling like it could go somewhere, like they were going to catch their killer. It was suddenly attached to a person who had been close enough to their lives to be remembered, and his name was Bob. Bob Atkins. I know this name is completely new to all of you because I did not mention every single neighbor on that block that the Hibbs were friends with. But I will let you know, when they were welcomed to the neighborhood, I told you that little David would go around on his bike, he would meet people and then introduce him to his family. Well, Bob was one of those people that David initially met with when they first got in the neighborhood, and they were only 2 houses down. And his wife, April, got introduced to Joy, and they became friends really fast. But the Atkins actually moved away a few months earlier. Charlie still remembered that car, though. Dark blue Monte Carlo. Bob talked about it like it was an extension of his own body. He wanted one for so long, and he had just recently been able to purchase one. Charlie explained that the Monte Carlo had originally belonged to April's grandma, so Bob's wife's grandmother. And Bob was so proud when he got it. So that's why it stood out. But does this even have relevance? Was the car even there that day? And was it even Bob Atkins? Because remember, like I told you, Monte Carlo was a popular type of car. Maybe people just remembered seeing it around in the past. But what they did have right now was a name that connected to the neighborhood and most importantly, connected to Joy because Bob was friends with this family. So they had to check him out. I know all their friends were going to get questioned sooner or later, but you have to just check everyone off your list one by one. So no better time than now, right? They asked Charlie first, what was his relationship with Bob and April? And Charlie, even in his grief, he was clear. Joy and April, they were friends, as I said. And Joy was the kind of woman who could make a friendship happen just by being herself because she was so personable. And April had a little toddler. He was only 2 years old. Joy loved babies, and she would scoop up their little kid and bounce him around on her hip. I mean, her and April would talk in their kitchen for hours about parenting and life and everything that was going on in the neighborhood. But when it came to Bob, well, of course, Bob wasn't good friends with Joy, but Charlie had to think about Bob. There was just something that kind of rubbed Charlie the wrong way. He was the kind of guy, Charlie said, you tolerated because you had to live on the same street, but he also never felt like you could fully relax around him. And the kids noticed it too. Bob was impatient, he had a short fuse, but most of all, the neighborhood knew something that he couldn't hide. Because when the windows were open on warm nights, you could hear Bob yelling at his wife, April, from 2 houses away, from more than 2 houses away. Not once or even twice. Enough that it was actually like part of the background noise of their neighborhood. David later described it like a switch flipping. It was like Bob could change out of nowhere. He would be sitting at their house smiling, and then a moment later, he was like, enough is enough, I'm out of here. It was like little things bothered Bob. And that's when detectives asked a question that probably wasn't easy for Charlie to answer. Even though he had come to the station determined to give them everything he could, had Joy been connected to Bob in any other way? And you know what they mean. They're asking like, could they be, in a relationship of any kind? Let's be honest. No relationship is perfect. There could be things going on behind closed doors that people don't know about. And also, some people raise their voices. Some relationships are toxic. And this wouldn't be the first neighbor that someone could hear yelling. I mean, just last week, I heard one of my immediate neighbors screaming and they were saying, no, leave. This isn't going to work. Did I call the cops? No. But what I'm trying to make the point of here is like, some of this is kind of normal, even though we shouldn't normalize it. Bob would yell. He would raise his voice. He would raise his voice to his wife, and that really just didn't seem related to anything with Joy. But the detectives noticed that Charlie hesitated when they asked that question, almost like he was avoiding the answer, not because he didn't want to help them, but because possibly there was a complicated layer to it that he wasn't ready to talk about, and that was true. And it involved marijuana. He was honest. He told the detectives that him and Joy enjoyed smoking some weed, only on the weekends, not constantly, not in a way that interfered with their life or their responsibilities, and they didn't let their kids know. It was just to relax. Charlie even took detectives to the garage and showed them where he kept his small stash. And that's when he told them it came from Bob Atkins. He was their go-to guy, but of course, not only does Charlie not want to rat out his former neighbor, he really doesn't want to paint himself or his now deceased wife in a negative light. But he did go on to admit that sometimes Joy bought it from him too, about $20 worth when she needed something, to take the edge off, so to speak. It wasn't some huge operation or this big reveal, but in an investigation like this, even the smallest details, they matter because it could tie something else together, especially because detectives already knew from the autopsy, there was a toxicology report. It showed that there was marijuana in Joy's system, just a small amount of cannabis. That was not significant at the autopsy, and it didn't seem that significant now either. But since they were on a roll with these questions, detectives had another one for Charlie. If Bob was his source, what was that relationship like, especially lately? Was he still selling him stuff, ever since he moved out of the neighborhood? And he was like, no, that was it. As far as he knew, that was the extent of any relationship or connection between the Hibbs and the Atkins, when you're speaking at Bob in particular. Because yes, he still sold to them from time to time, but that was it. There wasn't anything else. There wasn't some like hidden drama or affairs going on, nothing like that. So detectives moved to a new topic. They needed Charlie to think really hard. Was there anyone or anything different about Joy's life leading up to April 19th? Because a homicide followed by an arson doesn't usually come out of nowhere. It tends to come after something, some kind of conflict, fixation, escalation. And that is when Charlie remembered something: the vandalism. Charlie explained that about 2 months before Joy was killed, someone had thrown a brick through their front window of their house. And at the time, they kind of brushed it off. They thought, okay, maybe it's bored kids in the neighborhood, teenagers being stupid. It's just the kind of thing you complain about, but then you just clean it up. But the thing was, it didn't stop. Not long after this, Joy came home to something that felt more aggressive and more personal. The rear door to their house had been kicked in so violently, it was hanging crooked on the hinges, and this wasn't a prank. This wasn't just like a thrown rock. This was someone putting a lot more effort and force into their home, which was their space and their safe space, and it almost came off as a warning, and that concerned them. And I was thinking, yeah, that's definitely over the top, and Joy was shaken enough. She drove to David's school. She signed him out early, and the reason she did this is she thought that maybe she could question her own son as if he maybe heard something in the neighborhood, but he didn't. And he was confused and worried because he didn't even have the answers. Joy then asked her teenage daughter, and she didn't know either. They had no obvious enemies, no real reason that anyone would do this. And if it wasn't kids in the neighborhood, like she hoped it was, she thought maybe it could be resolved by just walking to a parent's home, having a talk with them. Maybe their kids did this, but that wasn't it. So that made her really concerned. And then several weeks later, she woke up and Joy found all 4 of her car tires slashed. And by the time detectives heard this back-to-back sequence of events, brick, door, tires, this did not sound random at all. It sounded like someone was testing their boundaries. They were getting bolder. And Charlie explained that he did have this awkward encounter about 2 months before all this vandalism even started. And remember, he's being questioned about Bob. So he's kind of still thinking, okay, was there anything weird with Bob at the same time? And he said, yes, the only thing he can remember is that Bob approached him. He's working on Joy's car in the front driveway, and he knew that Charlie was a contractor. So he's asking him in a way where Charlie could tell this was not legit what he wanted him to do. He wanted him to submit like fake invoices, contractor invoices to his insurance company as part of like a fraudulent thing, like a scheme to defraud his insurance company. Of course, Charlie refused, like outright. And that's why he was kind of surprised that Joy was still keeping in touch with April, because he told his wife about this. After the Atkins moved out, Joy was still hanging out with April. They weren't the nicest or the most respectable people, so I guess that kind of shocked Charlie. And what it insinuated was that maybe Bob was mad that, Charlie wouldn't lie and make these fake invoices, but they weren't sure that all of this was relevant. So they spoke to the kids. They spoke to Angie first. They asked her for a list of friends, acquaintances, classmates, all first and last names, because they wanted to get to the bottom of whether a kid had done some of the vandalism. They interviewed kids from Spencer Drive, from the school, anyone that could have any reason to target this family, and nothing surfaced. No one came forward. No one had a grudge. There wasn't any kind of school drama. Sometimes teenagers, they start dating and they get upset and their emotions are running high, and maybe they would throw a rock or a brick through a window, but no. And then they interviewed David. Remember, he's 12. He's still stunned. He's still scared. He's in this new reality where he doesn't feel safe anymore. And before detectives even went in, Charlie had pulled him aside and told him something simple. He said, tell them everything. Don't hold anything back. And that was good advice. I think David would have been honest anyway, but he listened to his father. And when the detectives asked David who could have wanted to hurt his mom, he didn't even have to struggle to think of a name. He didn't have to guess or put a list of maybes together. He instantly said, Bob Atkins. So here's Bob again. That doesn't seem like a coincidence. Unless maybe Charlie said something to David like, hey, they're talking about Bob, and the Monte Carlo came up, and now they're thinking even more. But why Bob? Well, David said he witnessed something that concerned him. It happened a few weeks before his mom's murder. David overheard his mom on the phone with Bob. He recognized Bob's voice. He said his mom was in the kitchen, holding the receiver away from her ear because Bob was yelling so loudly it filled up the entire room. David could clearly hear the volume, the anger, and the way that it made Joy visibly shake. And after the call, David asked his mom, what's going on? And Joy actually told him. She said, listen, parents, adults, they sometimes, like a glass of wine, they also smoke weed. And I bought some weed from Bob in April. And when I opened the bag, I was surprised and disappointed that it was junk. It was stems and seeds. It couldn't even be used. And she genuinely felt ripped off. So she simply called Bob. They're supposed to be friends. And she asked for her money back. She thought at the very least April would understand, but Bob was the one who had an issue with it. He took it personally. He thought that she was saying, you sell crap, your product isn't quality, and that's not what he wanted going around. I already explained, this dude had a short fuse. He was very impatient, and now I guess he was feeling personally attacked, and he went off on Joy. And you really can't do much when you lose money in a transaction like that. But Bob exploded. And David said he recalled that Bob threatened his mom, even saying, I'll kill you and I'll blow up your house. And I'm thinking, wow, now his mom's dead and a fire had been started in their home? That seems very specific. But here's what's worse. Joy begged David not to tell his dad. Not because she was trying to protect Bob, but because she was protecting their peace. Joy was always the one trying to keep everything together, not wanting to escalate anything. And she was really worried that Charlie was going to go confront Bob, and that would be a confrontation that could get so ugly so fast. So David stayed quiet. He kept that secret because his mom told him to. And then David said, that's when the vandalism started. So he wondered if it was connected. Well, there was another neighbor, Sharon McGuigan, and she lived right behind Bob and April. She was also interviewed when they were canvassing the neighborhood, and she said that something stood out. She was the mom of 5 children. She lived with her husband right behind Bob and April, and they had this fence you could kind of see through. One afternoon, she's cleaning up some branches, and some of them fell from her backyard into Bob's. He was out there. He took the branches and he literally threw them back on Sharon's property, like violently, aggressively threw them back over, almost like he was doing it in a threatening manner. But that's not all. She was standing there, and he knew that. And he went off on her, and he threatened to kill her and blow up her house. Again, pretty specific. Sharon didn't even know Joy. She knew no one in the Hibbs family, but when she heard that Joy had been murdered and her house was on fire, that incident between her and Bob stood out, so she went to detectives. Now, I know it's probably not common for you to say those things, but there still are people that say, I'm going to kill you, or I could just kill you. Now, I don't know about the blowing up your house part. That seems really specific, like I mentioned. But at the very least, what they needed right now is to hear from Bob Atkins himself. From the beginning, they wanted to make it clear they didn't care about him dealing, but the threats, that was concerning. They really wanted to know his version of what he was doing on April 19th of 1991. And finding him was really easy. He wasn't some stranger who just vanished. He and his wife kept in touch with their former neighbors. Officers tracked them down to an apartment complex about 15 minutes away from Spencer Drive. It was close enough that even hearing that detail made them, pique their interest even more because they're like, okay, he doesn't live that far away. And suddenly, I think it's like another little pink flag that they put down, it only takes him about 15 minutes to drive to and from, maybe faster if you're in a rush. But when detectives sat him down, he does not act like he's hiding anything. He kind of came in with an attitude of being irritated, which, wasn't surprising considering they've already been told this guy's impatient. It was almost an inconvenience for him to be there. And he acted like they were blowing the whole thing out of proportion. He admitted right away, I did sell cannabis to Joy. Especially in the weeks before she died, yes, I did. He didn't try to hide that part at all. And he even acknowledged they had argued about the quality. That Joy complained, asked for her money back, and Bob said, it wasn't serious. It was just a misunderstanding, but the fact is I could not give her money back. I didn't have it. He was pissed. He let it be known. And that was it. But when detectives pressed him about what David had told them and what the neighbor had said, that he had threatened both Joy and the neighbor with, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to blow your house up, Bob denied it flatly, like flat out. He's like, no, I was mad, but I did not say that. And he denied threatening to blow up the house. He denied that. And he denied having anything to do with the murder or the fire. Nothing to do with this death at all. He said that argument was so small, there's no way to even put it in the same sentence as a murder. It was a small disagreement between friends. The detectives did what they always do in this moment. They asked him, well, fine. Remember, I told you in another case that I heard in the Brian Walsh case very recently, one of the detectives say they don't doubt people. They actually believe, but they verify. And that's what they were trying to do. So they're like, where were you on Friday, April 19th? And Bob doesn't hesitate. He's able to tell them exactly what he did that day. He told them him and his wife and his kids were nowhere near the neighborhood that day. They went on a trip. They left shortly before noon on Friday, drove to the Poconos, and they were there all weekend. He said this was a family trip. They stayed with their 2 kids in a lodge, and they can go verify it. They gave them the information, and detectives did check out his story, and it lined up. The detectives drove to the Poconos themselves. They spoke with the employees, and the staff confirmed the Atkins family had paid for a room on April 19th. And I mean, you can't argue with an alibi that's pretty much on paper. And people love concrete things, receipts, registries, confirmation from strangers in a uniform. And what I mean by that is, if it's like a friend clarifying where you were for your alibi, or like your partner or your child, that doesn't hold as much weight as a hotel employee that has no connection with this case at all. But of course, the detectives want to ask, do you have any other things that can lock in your timeline? And Bob added another detail that seemed to seal it. He told detectives he received a phone call at their apartment, and when he gave them the time, it lined up with the time the murder would have been occurring, right? And this wasn't like small talk. He said he got a call that was connected to his wife. Since they were leaving town, they had to let April's coworker, Tanya, know she can't carpool with April because April wasn't going to be there. So April and Tanya Goldley had 2 conversations that day from the apartment landline. It's not like a cell phone where it's bouncing off towers. They have a record of the call coming from a place where you have to stand to take said calls. One call was April alerting her work that she wasn't going to be coming in, and the other one was alerting her coworker she wasn't going to be able to drive her. After the detectives were able to confirm Bob and April's whereabouts and their alibis and everything was solid, they asked Bob a question that they ask many people, because it gives them a direction to pursue depending on the answer. And you might guess what this is because I say it in most cases. They asked him to take a polygraph test. And I feel like a broken record, but we all know they're not reliable. They're not admissible in court. They're really just for detectives to use them to gauge somebody's demeanor. Whether they're willing to take it or not means something to them. And Bob said he didn't think it would be worth it. The reason being he had carpal tunnel and a damaged nerve, and these were conditions that would skew the results. He was also on some kind of medication that made him like anxious or his heart rate go up or something. So detectives didn't want to force him into doing it, right? But the refusal like that, they're definitely noted in the book. They're tucked away as just like another pinkish red flag. But they can't hold Bob on anything. He's free to go. And that is when everything shifted to the Monte Carlo. Because remember, neighbors hadn't just described a car. They described a dark blue 1980s era Chevy Monte Carlo parked oddly outside the Hibbs home during the window when detectives believed that Joy was killed. So investigators want to know, does Bob have the same car? So the next person they interviewed was a teenager named Colleen Kelly. Now she's a neighbor and also one of Angie's friends. Colleen had seen the Monte Carlo on the day of the murder. She passed it twice. She remembered it clearly. She drove past it around 12:40 the first time and again on her way out at 1:05 p.m., and she said the car was still there. Detectives do something a little risky at the time, but they take this teenager in their car, and I'm thinking, where are her parents at this point? I don't know, but maybe they had consent. They take her in a police vehicle, and they drive it to Bob's apartment complex. And in the parking lot was a 1987 black, not dark blue, black Monte Carlo, registered to Bob and April Atkins. And that's the car that police show Colleen. She looks over and she goes, no. She wasn't hesitant at all. It wasn't like she was just not sure. No, it was a flat out no. That is not the car I saw outside the Hibbs home. Color's wrong. The wheels are wrong. It's not the car. She said she's 100% certain. So now there's a problem. If Colleen's right, then the Monte Carlo outside of the Hibbs home wasn't Bob's Monte Carlo. They don't have a plate. They don't have a driver. They don't have any physical evidence tying Bob to the scene. So the Monte Carlo detail, it stuck out, but it was frustrating. It's just one of those things that can't be proven. It's very frustrating. They can't get a warrant. They can't get a path forward. And they were expecting that would all line up and be a smoking gun. You know, the so-called threats, the anger that Bob possessed. They were expecting a match, and then the case just stalled again. And it was like their potential suspect list kept shrinking and shrinking. So that is when they have to do something that they do at this point. They go inward. You know, it's a circle, and it's always the people that are closest to the victim. But now that they've gone out of the circle, they have to work towards the inside again, meaning towards family. And it was something that nobody wanted to hear. These children were already holding on by a thread, but they were going to start looking at someone who lived with Joy, her own husband. After all, he was the one giving all these clues and tips. He was the one giving Bob's name, talking about the Monte Carlo, providing leads to detectives. But could it be deflection? To Angie and David, even hearing something like that, it's like grief hit them all over again. Because yes, their dad actually had a temper sometimes. He raised his voice. He did have, expressions of irritation, but was he violent? No. Those children knew without a shadow of a doubt the only person who adored Joy as much as they did was their father. Their whole family identity was built around their parents being perfect for one another, in love. That they loved each other so, so much. So even thinking that their father could do this, it was so shocking. It was beyond that. But of course, detectives don't operate on family feelings. They're operating on what they can prove. And they thought, if David was keeping secrets for his mother, because Joy asked him to, what kind of other secrets was she keeping from her own husband? They wondered. Charlie was once again in that interview room at the police station, but this time they were pressing him harder. They were asking him questions not in a gentle and sympathetic way. No, they were asking, were you having an affair? Was Joy? Did you owe money? Were there financial problems? Did you ever put your hands on her? They asked everything about their marriage, the stress, the fights. Were there any cracks showing? Because in their minds, the brutality of that attack felt very personal. I mean, a stabbing attack in of itself, they always say you're up close and personal with someone. Doesn't mean you have to be related to them, but there is some kind of rage in that kind of killing. And Charlie was so wrecked. He kept breaking down in this interview. He was crying. He was trembling. These detectives were asking him to relive the worst day of his life and to defend himself, to prove that he didn't do this. All the while he's grieving. And the children were interviewed as well. Even with everything they were going through, they needed to know, did you ever see anything get out of control? Did Charlie ever get violent? It rattled Angie so badly. It actually made her doubt her own father just for a moment. And that thought alone horrified her because deep down, of course she didn't believe it, but she was living with him. Can you imagine? It's just like you kind of let it cross your mind. But to Angie, she always had this truth in her that she knew in her heart. This was not something that came from inside this family, that her mom was murdered by someone outside of this house. And of course, Charlie was talking to all of his friends and his family members about why they were targeting him. His explanation was, it was the way he looked. The long hair, the beard, the tattoos, the motorcycle, the fact that he rode with a biker group called Abate, which was described by him as a charity-based writing group, not a criminal writing group. But he felt like the detectives just saw him as a biker dude, and they had all their own assumptions about him, but still, he refused to let that bother him. He showed up, he talked, he didn't disappear, and he didn't lawyer up. He cooperated fully. He did things that other people wouldn't do. He took polygraph after polygraph. He took 3 of them, and he repeated his timeline again and again. He was working at a construction job in downtown Philadelphia, 20 miles from his home. He'd been on that job site since 6:30 that morning with all of his coworkers, and when he heard that his house was on fire, he raced home. And when he arrived, people actually saw him collapse, hysterical, devastated, inconsolable. This guy wasn't the killer, and he was trying to prove that. And eventually, the detectives corroborated everything. Coworkers confirmed that Charlie had never left that job site downtown until he left after learning about the fire. All 3 polygraphs said he was being truthful. So now I was thinking, couldn't they have confirmed all of that before breaking this poor man down? But they have to do that. They have their ways. Detectives examined everything anyway, including the couple's finances, homeowners insurance policy on the house, and they determined that nothing suggested that this would be a motive, that it wasn't a financial motive with a husband and a wife, like life insurance and things like that. So Charlie was cleared in practice, but he wasn't in the minds of everyone around. When you're investigated for your wife's murder, even when you're cleared, the damage is already done. People already know. People would look at him with suspicion. He couldn't go anywhere without someone whispering, like, I think he might have killed his wife. But what was so hard for this family to think about is while they're being questioned, the killer had time. Time to settle their own story. Time to blend back into normal life. Time to get away, to disappear. And it felt like such a waste of time. And by July of that year of 1991, Charlie tried to do the only thing he could think of that might force the case to move forward. He offered a $5,000 reward for information, and by then, the fire had destroyed nearly every picture this family owned. And I saw one of their albums scattered around the house with some of the remnants of those pages in the kitchen. They were just blurred and melted into just smears of paint. It was so heartbreaking. So relatives and friends, they gathered what they could from birthdays, snapshots from school portraits, and candid pictures, and they brought them all to Charlie, Angie, and David. It's like they were returning a piece of their life that these flames had stolen away from them. And they knew they could never get joy back, but at least they could have their memories. They could hold onto them again and look at them. Look at all the good times they've had. And at this point, Charlie's trying to regain control over anything that he could. And that's when he made the decision. He cut his long hair, he shaved off his beard, and he explained, I want to look more decent. Not because he was ashamed of who he was, but because he didn't want his appearance to distract from what mattered, and that was them investigating Joy's murder in a different direction and his children. He wanted the truth. Even though I hate to say this, but it actually made him look more suspicious at this point because this was not too far after what happened. So now people are thinking, well, why are you changing your looks? But Charlie didn't care. Right now, his focus was on the house and his children. Now, they did have to stay in an apartment for a while, but Charlie wanted to rebuild that house. First of all, because they couldn't afford to move anywhere else, and because Charlie was in construction. So his construction company gave him paid time off so he could actually work on repairs. And close friends started to help him out. And then something really magical happened. And I felt like this was like the modern day GoFundMe. I mean, they didn't have GoFundMe in 1991. So what I'm saying is all of his biker friends, they started showing up one after the other. There were carpenters, roofers, HVAC, electricians, and plumbers. And they came donating their time to help rebuild this house piece by piece. And to me, that was just so inspiring. I mean, they came out, they put their sweat equity into this. These men who often were judged by their looks the same way that Charlie was, they were quietly doing the kind of work that makes headlines, but also holds up this grieving family when they're about to literally fall apart. But it was during that cleanup when Charlie, he's sorting through with the fire left behind and he finds something else and he stops. He's frozen. He looks at it in a coat closet near the front door. he comes across a piece of fabric. It's black and white flannel material, and it looks like it has dried blood on it. Right away, this pattern is familiar in his mind, and it made his stomach drop. He believed that he had seen April Atkins wearing a shirt with a flannel pattern just like it. But again, just want to point this out. It's kind of like Captain Obvious, but this is 1991. A flannel in the 90s. Even right now, I have a black and white flannel outfit. Almost everyone had something like that in their closet. But Charlie, he wasn't going to hesitate. He did not talk himself out of showing this to police. He called them immediately. And detectives collected that piece of fabric and sent it to the FBI for testing because you never know. And for the first time in a long time, Charlie felt like he finally had something tangible, something in his hand that he could physically turn over, give to the FBI, and get an answer. But when the envelope came back from the FBI, it really didn't look like it was going to provide anything. It was so thin. It was too thin, he thought, for it to carry any weight. And he was right. The results he got back on that scrap of black and white flannel, it didn't have anything significant on it. No DNA, no blood typing, no clear result that could be held up in a courtroom. Nothing. But it doesn't mean there couldn't have been, and the fire could have destroyed it. Could there have been something on that fabric? The truth was, there was a problem. The fire had erased what investigators usually lean on. Extreme heat and thousands of gallons of water wipes out the kind of evidence that tells you what was in a room and what happened in what order. I know in these deep dives, I like to tell you everything I found, and I can't choose what to leave out sometimes, but I also wanted to tell you what Charlie had said to reporters. He told them he doesn't believe in God anymore because he said if there was a God, this wouldn't have happened. She never hurt anyone in her life. And then he added the kind of detail that only a real spouse would mention because it was so human. She had me on a diet. She had me not smoking. And then, like he was confessing how numb he had become, he said, now I'll die tomorrow, and I don't care. It doesn't bother me. I'm concerned about my children. And that was the thing. That was the one thing he could still hold on to because in the aftermath, he realized something Joy had always quietly handled without any praise. Everything. And isn't that the truth? So many of us are like super moms handling it all without anyone truly knowing everything we do. He couldn't believe it. Joy was the household organizer, the keeper of routines, the one who made sure the bills were paid, the details wouldn't fall through the cracks. And after she was gone, Charlie just had this disorienting reality feeling because basic life tasks felt very unfamiliar to him. He didn't know how to write a check. He didn't know how to pay the bills. Life without Joy there, it wasn't just heartbreaking. It was like everything changed overnight for him. And the kids, they weren't handling things very well either. Teens are already rebellious by nature. They test boundaries, they experiment with attitudes, and hormonal changes are happening. And on top of all that, they lost their mom. So Angie and Charlie, they just start clashing constantly. They were once very close. They had that father-daughter connection, and it started to crack. And after about a year and a half, Charlie just made another decision. He couldn't live in that house anymore. The structure could be repaired, but the atmosphere inside, it just couldn't. So he ended up selling the Spencer Drive home. And in 1993, he and the kids moved to Montgomery County. I don't have to tell you this, but Joy's case had gone cold. I mean, I just told you, 1993. And after that move, Charlie would call detectives for updates over and over, begging for movement, anything. And eventually, one detective told him very bluntly, cases without progress often went on the shelf. Okay, on the shelf is in air quotes. And that's really sad, that it is just sitting there collecting dust. And years passed, life moved forward. David went off to college in New York City, and later he moved to Oregon and built a career as a nurse practitioner. He was trying to create a life that wasn't going to be defined by his mom being murdered. Angie got married, she had a family, she worked in industrial safety, often saying that the hardest part of motherhood was actually doing it without her own mom by her side. Holidays, birthdays, all those milestones, there was always an empty space where Joy should have been. Then, in 2006, yes, we're going to 2006, David was back in the area for a medical conference, and he did something that makes so much sense when you've lived with unanswered questions long enough. He walked right into the Bristol Township Police Department in person, and he asked, "Can my mom's case file be forwarded to the VDOC Society, the Pennsylvania-based group that reviews very difficult cold cases?" Now, this man wasn't trying to pick a fight. He's trying to get help for his mom's case, but he gets resistance. The detective was actually kind of cold to him, and this conversation was very tense, and David wondered why. Even he got angry. His temper rose, he said, because this wasn't a file to him. It was his mother. That's all he had left, is the answers. He wanted answers. And then the detective did something really unsettling that really upset David. He told him the detectives believed all along his father, Charlie, had done it. Really, because we're back at Charlie again. But in that one sentence, 15 years of uncertainty, David's certainty about who his father was cracked. He was forced to think about it because he was thinking, when the detectives say something like that, you can't help but wonder, do they know something that I don't? Now they've introduced doubt. And that doesn't just disappear. And unfortunately, it caused an estrangement between David and his father. It made it very hard for him to be close to him unless he knew 100% for a fact that his father wasn't involved. Can you imagine what that was like for Charlie? It was painful. Both of his children had been pulled away from him. Their whole family had been torn apart. Even more, Charlie remained in Pennsylvania until 2012. 2012, I'm going to, okay? Jumping from the 90s, the early 2000s, into 2012. And that is when Charlie finally retired. The following year, after his father passed away, he moved to Washington State to be even closer to his mother. And even across the country, even decades later, that grief of losing his wife stayed with him. And the Hibbs family made a rule without even calling it a real rule. They wouldn't let even, a couple years pass, and I still think that's a lot, without checking in. Every so often, somebody would call, and they were hoping, and when I say call, I mean to the police. Every 2 years or so, they would check in, and they would ask the same question, hoping there would be a different answer. That they would hear more than, the case is active, because they would always hear that. But there was still no movement. Same answer, so frustrating, nothing was being done. And now I'm going to jump a couple years later to 2014, because there was truly nothing to report until then. David had hit a point where he couldn't be quiet anymore about his mother's case. He agreed to do an interview with the Huffington Post, and he publicly accused the Bristol Township Police Department of mishandling the investigation from the very beginning. He was angry, but it was desperation, and that timing mattered because Bucks County had just started a new effort to re-examine cold cases. Now, David's interview did not create this moment, but it hit at exactly the right time to get Joy's case back into the spotlight. And that is how Detective Mike Slaughter enters the story. And yes, you heard that correctly, Slaughter, a homicide detective named Detective Slaughter. He didn't get assigned the case like routine paperwork, though. He actually requested it. Detective Slaughter had been on the force for 17 years. So he knew something. The longer a case sits, the more people start treating it like a relic instead of a responsibility. But when Joy's case crossed his desk, it bothered him. From the beginning, something about it didn't feel cold, it felt unfinished. And I really like that. I was like, I really like this detective. And I was like, I'm ready, because I just knew. I was like, he's starting to do what an investigator should have done from the beginning. Because when he starts looking through, he's expecting organization. He's expecting things checked off. He's expecting to see what has been done. And what he found, he called disturbing. There were very few recorded interviews. Notes were scattered. Some were handwritten, some were typed, some weren't even legible. Major investigative steps were either missing entirely or they were never documented in a way that could be verified. It wasn't just old. This file was incomplete, and that's really, really bad. Back in school when your teacher would tell you in math class to show your work? Well, it was the same here, except they didn't. It was like someone tried to solve this case, but not leave behind a map of how they were doing it. Like, why was it cold? Detective Slaughter tried reaching out to the original investigators because he wanted clarification. He was hoping that someone was going to fill in the missing pieces, but instead, crickets. Complete silence. People who wanted nothing to do with talking about this case. And if you're a detective and you're staring at a homicide file and the people who are working on it don't want to discuss it, not even casually, that's not just retirement distance. It's avoidance. There was a reason. So if you're a detective, what's going to happen? You're going to get more interested in it. So he did the only thing he could do. He started over from the beginning. Not from 1991 evidence because the fire doesn't preserve much for you, but from the people who lived the case. And obviously that started with the Hibbs family. Charlie Hibbs first. Now, I have to say, it was probably exhausting having to be questioned again, but it had been so many years, and still, it was so hurtful to relive those moments. But it was a really exciting moment that this case was back in a detective's hand again. Detective Slaughter made Charlie start from the very beginning and go over everything that he had ever told investigators. He even asked questions in 3 different ways. He pressed him, and still nothing changed. He told him he went to work, he didn't leave during the time that Joy was killed, and he finally left when he heard that his house was on fire. And at this point, and this point only, Charlie Hibbs was completely cleared. Completely. And then Detective Slaughter kept just clearing people until he came right back. Can you guess who? To Bob Atkins. Bob had always been listed as a person of interest, but never changed. In the original investigation, he didn't go to a suspect. He wasn't treated as a priority. And I think you know why. We got the alibis. He went on vacation, his wife and kids. We know the story, the calls. But by 2014, Bob and April, they had been divorced. And that's when Detective Slaughter thought of something. And you probably know this. A divorce, it can open people up. They can say things they might not have wanted to share before. So he was hoping that distance, time, separation, and the fact that, April's no longer living with Bob, no longer with Bob, maybe she would talk and maybe she could provide something she didn't back then. So he decided to surprise her with a little visit. And she was actually willing to sit down and talk. April told him the same story, though. The same one that was in the file for years. She and Bob left for the Poconos around noon on April 19th. They checked into their hotel. They stayed the weekend. But when Slaughter was listening, detectives aren't just hearing the words. They're listening to your tone. And there was something that really bothered him about the way she was delivering the information. And what he found is that it was so precise. It wasn't conversational. It was just so fact-based, like this, like a list, almost like she was reading something. And then he wondered, why that day? Why did they go away that day? Was this a planned vacation? Because it seemed like pretty impromptu to just go away. And it wasn't planned. And Slaughter had a lot of experience. He just felt like everything April was saying was rehearsed. It wasn't like she was recalling her day naturally. And then she said something really concerning. She told him that in all the years since Joy's murder, not one detective, not one police officer from the Bristol Township Department had ever spoken to her. Not in 1991 and no time afterward. And if that was true, it meant that even the most basic steps in this investigation never even happened. So 2 days later, Detective Slaughter is at Bob's door. And he still had the same energy, the same demeanor that his neighbors on Spencer Drive remembered. Tightly coiled, defensive, impatient. And it was in this way that made you feel like, you had to walk on eggshells. You had to measure every word you used around him because he was just so annoying. Like he would get annoyed and want to storm out. And everything was on his terms. But he acknowledged the cannabis dispute as he did before. And he dismissed it, just like he had from the beginning. He denied threatening Joy. And when Detective Slaughter asked him where he was on April 19th, 1991, Bob gave the same exact alibi that he'd given decades ago. Home until noon, phone to April's work and to a coworker, Tanya, and then the Poconos trip. And after he talks to Bob about all this, Detective Slaughter goes to verify all the details. And he wondered, had anyone done this before? And sure, we already heard. Detectives went to the hotel. They confirmed that the Atkins had been there. But Detective Slaughter wondered, where's the notes? Where are the photocopies of the hotel registry? Where are the receipts with times? Because guess what? They weren't in the files. But the good news is this hotel transferred everything from the past over to digital, and the hotel registry showed that April did not sign in until 4:53 p.m. Now, that did not match the version that they left around noon, drove up like it was this simple family getaway. That drive was about 90 minutes. It's not the kind of trip that explains this huge gap between the murder window and the check-in time. That's now suspicious. And then Detective Slaughter went after those phone calls. Remember that detail that Bob leaned into saying, well, this will show that I was home because I have a landline. Well, he traced the number back to April's coworker, Tanya, the woman that April carpooled with sometimes. She said she did remember speaking with Bob on that day, on the day of the murder, but the timing she described didn't support the alibi the way Bob wanted it to. She said the call happened somewhere between 1 o'clock and 1:30 p.m. And you know what I was thinking? So many years have gone by. How could she have possibly remembered this? I can't even recall what time I ate breakfast yesterday, let alone a specific time of a phone call from, 23 years ago. But if she was right, the clock in David's room stopped at 12:54. Joy would have been already dead when Bob made that phone call. The drive from the Hibbs home to the Atkins was about 15 minutes. And the call that April made to her boss let him know that she wasn't going to make it at work that day, that was at 2:15 p.m., well after Joy had been killed. Now, that's 3 alibi times that don't make sense for Bob. The call that had once supported Bob's alibi now suggested the opposite. There was plenty of time for him to have committed the murder and returned home before answering the phone. But then Bob casually offers another piece of information that made Detective Slaughter even more suspicious of literally this entire investigation. Because Bob says, in 1991, I was actually working as a confidential informant for the Bristol Township Narcotics Unit. As in, the same police department that was working Joy's case. Bob admitted he was also using. He was using meth and he was also using cannabis, and he was helping others obtain these substances. But he said, I wasn't a dealer. I was just helping the police. I don't know if you can see where Slaughter's mind went, but it was in that moment that Joy's case stopped feeling like a case that simply went cold, and it started feeling like a case that was kept cold on purpose. And why was he thinking that? Well, when a police department has a conflict of interest, that's a problem. Because if Bob Atkins had relationships inside the department, relationships that benefited this narcotics unit, then the question became unavoidable. Did that relationship influence how seriously investigators were allowed to treat him in 1991? Because if he was valuable to them, then they might not want to ruffle any feathers. And Detective Slaughter wasn't going to let it go. He dug even deeper. And by December of 2015, he confirmed through an officer at Bristol Township, Officer Tommy Mills, that Bob had been an informant. He purchased substances for the narcotics unit and worked with a handler. And that handler was Detective Al Eastlack. I know this is a lot of names. You don't have to remember them. The fact of the matter is, this officer described going with Eastlack to Bob's apartment 2 days after Joy's murder to tell him, hey, Bob, your name came up in this murder investigation. You need to go ahead and contact homicide. Well, guess what? Bob doesn't let them inside the house. He wouldn't even shake their hand. He claimed his arm and his hand were paralyzed. This was something similar that he later told why he couldn't take the polygraph. Remember, he said he had carpal tunnel? But here's the significant detail. Officer Mills notices a dark-colored, late 1970s, maybe 80s Monte Carlo parked in the lot. And Bob told them that April's coworkers could confirm, oh, I was home. All the things we've already heard. But through further digging, a detective admitted that back in 1991, he tried to pursue Bob Atkins as a suspect, but was directly ordered by his superiors to, quote, stay away from Atkins, unquote. The reason wasn't lack of evidence. It wasn't because they cleared him. It was something else that's probably going to make you mad, because I know that I was so upset when I heard this. And it was the way that Detective Slaughter put it. He said it was because drug information is very valuable. You never trade a homicide case for it. Do you know what that means? It means that Joy lost her chance at justice because of an internal decision behind closed doors of the same department who promised to find her killer. Her case, her life, wasn't as important as ongoing information on dealers and things that could get them higher in the ranks because they were able to solve all these rings that were happening in the narcotics unit. Slaughter believed that Bob Atkins and possibly even his wife April were actually responsible for Joy's murder. People that she called friends. But as we know, a belief is not an arrest, it's not a conviction. But he forwarded everything he collected to the district attorney's office, and he was hoping that they were going to see what he was seeing. But not long after that, something else happened. On September 11th of 2016, April Atkins herself walked right into the Bristol Township Police Department holding Detective Slaughter's business card that he handed her 2 years before this. She said she was finally ready to talk. She had kept that little business card in her purse for 2 years, and she said she would pull it out, she would put it back inside, she would pull it out, she would argue with herself in silence about whether she should come forward. So you already know she's been hiding something. They meet for an interview, and she doesn't jump right to Joy Hibbs. She starts way further back. She talks about how her and Bob met. They were in high school together. She was shy. She was bullied. She was desperate for attention and for someone to make her feel safe, and Bob was that person. But she admits that safety didn't last. April described Bob as controlling, violent, and unpredictable. She said she found out he was using meth and steroids in addition to smoking and selling weed. And he had a temper, he had rage, he was dangerous and uncontrollable. The kind of man who didn't need to say, I'm dangerous, because your body learned it through repetition. And I think you understand what I'm saying. This poor woman was in not just a toxic relationship, but this was a domestic situation. And I think you know what I mean without me having to spell it out. She said she lived according to his moods, trying to anticipate what version of him she was going to get, whether she would set him off or not. And then she finally took a deep breath and she was like, okay, I'm finally here to talk about what I came here for. She told him that on the day Joy Hibbs was murdered, on Friday, April 19th of 1991, she'd been getting ready for her shift at the school she worked for students with special needs. It was in late morning when Bob walks through the door, and he wasn't just agitated, he wasn't just worked up. April said he was covered in blood. And she told Detective Slaughter she froze. Her brain couldn't even attach meaning to what her eyes were seeing at that moment. And before she could even ask, before she even had a chance to question him, Bob looked straight at her and he said, I stabbed someone and I lit a house on fire. And he said it just like that. Not something happened, not I need help. It was just this blunt sentence dropped into the middle of their normal morning routine like it was nothing. It was just like, hey, this is what happened today. Then April says he doesn't explain anything. He doesn't sit her down. He doesn't give her details, but he gives her orders. He says, call out of work, pack the kids, get in the car. And wow, I feel like you probably knew this all along, or maybe, at least you were hinting at it from all the clues, but their children were only 1 and 4 years old at the time. And April tells the detective she obeyed because she was terrified. Look what he just said he did. And she might be next if she hesitated. She said Bob threw his clothes into the wash, he showered, and then rushed them out the door. He drove so fast, she thought their car was going to flip. And the whole time, she felt like one wrong word could turn that violence onto her. I don't blame her at all, but I do question why so many years went by, but she's not done. She said they did drive to the Poconos, and at the lodge, they checked in under April's name, and they stay until Sunday. She talks about the next morning, and one detail stuck out so much, it just felt like evidence all by itself. She said that Bob had brand new shoes on, and she watched him carry a bag behind the hotel towards a wooded area, and when he came back, the bag was gone. April believed, and obviously so did the detectives at this point, he disposed of evidence, bloody clothing, shoes, anything that connected him to what he had done. When they returned home from the Poconos on Sunday, April said police were everywhere, and detectives came to the door to question Bob. But she stayed quiet. She told Detective Slaughter she stayed quiet because she understood Bob's threats in a way that nobody else did unless you lived with him like she did. He always carried a knife, and he would tap the pocket where he kept it when he wanted to intimidate her. It was like a reminder that he didn't even need to raise his voice. He didn't even need to speak a word to make her obey. She knew exactly what that little gesture meant. And April admitted something else that made Detective Slaughter's earlier interview with her snap right into focus, and it was like in this very sickening way. She said she had tried cautiously in the months after Joy's death to convince Bob to do the right thing. And every time she tried, he would physically harm her. And worse, he told her, if I ever get arrested, I'm going to blame you for Joy's murder. So that's when, in 2014, when he was speaking to April for the first time, she wasn't actually speaking freely. He was right. She was reciting. She told Detective Slaughter she repeated exactly what Bob instructed her to say. All the way back those years when they left to go to that hotel and they checked in, those were the same words that she repeated in her head for all of those years. It was true. That wasn't her memory. It was his script. So why is she coming forward now? Why is she walking into the station on September 11th of 2016? Years of silence. It's because something happened. She recently lost a man that she really loved. He was very special to her. He treated her with kindness. And this was right after her mother had passed away and also her niece. So that loss that she felt, she couldn't live a lie anymore. That grief did something to her for the very first time. She truly understood what Charlie Hibbs had lived with. She said, I can't carry a lie anymore. And at the end of that interview, Detective Slaughter thanked her for coming forward. He walked her out. And then he took that recording, he labeled it urgent, and he sent it straight to the DA's office. And I know what you're expecting. Oh my gosh, they're going to arrest him. The case is going to go to trial. No. Nothing happened. There was no arrest, no public movement, no explanation. It was literally silence. And can you believe another 5 years goes by? And this family still doesn't even know that they were so close to an inside confession. And it's sitting in a file since 2016. I mean, this family just assumed everything was stalled. They didn't know about April coming forward. Charlie was living across the country by then, and he believed the investigation had literally gone ice cold. They kept living inside the same pattern that they were stuck in for decades. They would call for updates. They would hear the same words. And now it was 2021. We've already experienced a pandemic, the new normal. Even that was still lingering by the time Charlie decided he was going to do something. He's 66 years old. He's retired. He's across the country from the street he used to live on where Joy's life ended. And he thought about her every day. And on the 30th anniversary of her death, 30 years to the day, Friday, April 19th, Charlie did something that wasn't small and it wasn't easy. He emptied his entire retirement savings and he posted $25,000 reward for information leading to a conviction. And at that point, the Philadelphia Inquirer interviewed him. And by June, that money was doubled. People came forward. The media got more attention to the point where People magazine got interested in Joy's case. And in November of that year, in 2021, they reached out to Charlie and they offered to do a segment on Joy's murder. They needed to interview people close to the case because of that. And journalists were reaching out to everyone, including the Bucks County District Attorney, Matt Weintraub, and the rest of the Hibbs family. And that's when the DA decides he's going to take a closer look at this case. He assigns a new lead detective, David Hanks, and the first thing he does is call April, because why not? You're looking in the case file from 2016 and you're thinking, that's basically an inside confession. He asked her to do something, though, to make a recorded phone call to her ex-husband, Bob. They wanted to be able to capture his own words in real time without him knowing exactly what was being built around him, and April agreed. This wasn't just a phone call, you have to remember this. This was possibly upsetting a man that she knew was violent, and she was hoping that she would be protected by this detective and his team. It's December 2021. Detective Hanks brings April to a hotel room so that it can be safely recorded. And what a moment. Quiet, under these fluorescent hotel lights, people speaking softly, all this equipment being set up, and her dialing a number that she wanted to forget. She never wanted to dial Bob's number again. He picks up, and April tells him the truth, sort of, that detectives had been asking her about Joy Hibbs. And she asked him, "What do you want me to say?" It's pretty smart, right? Like, hey, how to get it out of him. But Bob doesn't respond with confusion. He doesn't reply with sympathy. He responds like a man immediately calculating his risk. He says, "I don't know what you're talking about. I had an alibi. You know your coworker friend called that day. I answered the phone. I couldn't be in two places at once." But then in almost the same breath, he almost is warning her by saying, "You already said effing enough. Don't say anything. You do realize your phone is probably tapped, yeah?" That sentence matters. It tells you Bob wasn't just reacting. He was aware. He was thinking about surveillance. He was thinking about being recorded. He was thinking about how this could come back on him. Because why would he be concerned with a recorded line if he wasn't lying? I know we've been going for a long time. I definitely want to tell you what happens because this case it's still wild. There's still things to come. A month later, in January of 2022, the Bucks County District Attorney, they convene a grand jury to re-examine Joy's case. And when David Hibbs was notified, he couldn't believe it. It actually made him physically ill because there were so many emotions. Finally, though, this grand jury means these stakes are real. It means people are going to go on record. It means someone is about to decide whether this can become an arrest or whether it's going to be another dead end. A lot of people testified, especially April, under oath, repeated everything, that it wasn't a shared memory between spouses, it was a script. She reiterated everything her husband at the time told her to say. And afterward, in February, Bob did what he always resorted to in the past: intimidation. He sent April a screenshot of her roommate's Facebook page with the message, "You better choose your friends better." So what he was insinuating is that her roommate alerted him to the fact she was cooperating with detectives. Now, Charlie also testified before the grand jury. And this is when he learned, by listening to April's testimony, that she had already come forward years before in 2016 and admitted that she knew that Bob had murdered Joy and nothing was done about it. Charlie also learned in that moment that his son David had kept Joy's secret for years and years. That secret, remember, about Bob being filled with rage and threatening her over the phone before the vandalism started. He kept his mom's secret, even after he told detectives all of that time. Charlie also learned the full extent to which the Bristol Township Police let things go. An entire website was made by the Hibbs family, Justice for Joy. It chronicled her life, her family, and her tragic death, and it included news articles, press releases. A lot of things that I found there were very, very important for this case and for this story I'm telling you, and anything that could possibly lead to an arrest. And finally, on May 25th of 2022, Robert Atkins, Bob, 56 years old, was arrested for first-degree murder, arson, and robbery, 31 years after Joy was murdered. I found that 44-page criminal complaint arrest warrant, and this was on that website made by Joy's family. It was submitted by Detective Slaughter and Detective David Hanks. And inside I found out that even Bob Atkins, his own adult son Gabriel, testified before the grand jury saying that he remembers detectives coming to his door in April of 2022, and his dad turned to him and said, I'm afraid I'm going to get arrested for something that happened a long time ago. And Bob gave his son a story about how it was 30 years ago and involved a lady who was a biker chick. And she died in a fire and was stabbed. And he was somehow involved in some way. Even though Gabriel pressed him for more, he said his father only admitted that he might have done it. I mean, I think that's saying enough. In the arrest warrant, I found out that the black Monte Carlo was at one point painted a shiny blue color. Interesting. I mean, I really don't think they need any more. When he appeared for his arraignment, Bob told the judge he's disabled, unemployed, and living with his son and had prior arrests, but no convictions. And I was thinking, like that made him look any better. But while all that tension was boiling publicly, something was actually happening in the background. Something detectives could not manufacture or force with a subpoena. It came from the place that sometimes hold the ugliest truth. Family. After Bob Atkins' arrest, members of his extended family living out of state reached out to the DA's office, and they had something investigators needed to know. Something buried so deep in Bob's past. And it suddenly mattered a lot more. Now that his name was attached to a murder case, they told detectives about an incident from when Bob was only 15 years old. He was sent to live with his grandparents in rural Tennessee, and not long after he arrived, he violently attacked his 35-year-old aunt, his father's sister. She was a widow, living inside a mobile home, and according to what was later described, she was found strangled with a telephone cord. Her ribs were crushed from being stomped on. Her body was wrapped in a rug. Her pants had been pulled down, and to this day, it's unclear whether she had been violated. Bob had stolen her car and fled, and he was eventually located near the high school and arrested by his own grandfather, who was a constable. Now, luckily, his aunt survived, and it was unbelievable she forgave him, and she later died in 2016. Now, on its own, that history is horrifying, especially with the parallels between Joy's case and his aunt's. The cord, the crushed ribs, the sudden escalation of violence. But the family wasn't calling just to tell a dark story. They were calling because of what came next. They told investigators that 19 days before Joy was murdered, on Friday, April 19th, there was a family get-together, an Easter visit to Tennessee, and Bob had gone to see the same aunt. And in photographs taken during this visit, pictures that family had in albums for decades, there was one detail that was so important. A dark blue Monte Carlo was parked right outside this aunt's home. Blue Monte Carlo. I told you, it was painted blue at one point. The same make, the same color that multiple neighbors had reported seeing outside of Joy's home during the window that Joy was believed to have been killed. I mean, it all fits together. Sometimes it frustrates me so much because I'm like, had investigators done a lot of this differently and not dismissed this man because he was an informant and focused more on the fact that this car had been painted, this would have been solved so long ago. In 2023, Bob Atkins' stepmother, Barbara, testified at a preliminary hearing. She was 81 years old, but that didn't stop her. She wasn't trying to be dramatic. She was finally saying what families tried to hide because it's embarrassing or complicated or too hard to explain. We all have something like that going on, but this was a lot. She and Bob's father had struggled with Bob's behavior since before they were even married. She described him as having a short fuse. We already knew that. And she said that 1 month before their 1978 wedding, she and Bob's father were summoned to the court because 12-year-old Bob had been accused of making harassing phone calls to neighbors. And as he got older, they were actually afraid of him and what he might escalate into. And by 15, they worried that he was running with the wrong crowd, possibly using substances, and that his behavior was influencing the 7 other children that was in their household. So that's why they sent him to Tennessee. They were hoping that the distance in a rural, quiet area was going to straighten him out, but instead, it nearly ended in his aunt's death. And Barbara described how at the bench trial for that Tennessee attack, I'm talking about the one when he was 15, photographs of his aunt's injuries were shown. It was horrific. But somehow this judge concluded that Bob wasn't a high risk for re-offending, and they just placed him on probation. It blows my mind sometimes. I'm like, had someone done something and kept this man off the streets, things would have ended differently. Even his own parents wouldn't take him back. So he ended up in juvenile detention, and then later he was placed with other relatives. Eventually, he was ordered to live with his grandmother in Pennsylvania, and that is how he returned to Bucks County. His father and stepmother had cut ties with him completely. And all of these things from his past were building into something the prosecution thought could be very heavy and could hold a lot of weight for this case. A pattern of him being violent, a story of escalation, a possible vehicle link, and a long trail of fear. But of course, the defense had their own strategy. This case was mostly circumstantial, and they started filing motions, ones that they hoped were going to keep out a lot of crucial information. They were arguing that these incidents were too old, it was too prejudicial, and that it would poison the court's ability to fairly judge what happened on Friday, April 19th, 1991. And surprisingly, the judge agreed. That entire Tennessee incident with his aunt, the one that prosecutors hoped would help establish that Bob was capable of violence, that was too remote. It was ruled out. It could not be heard by a jury. And then the judge also excluded the most explosive part of April Atkins' account. The moment that she said Bob came in covered in blood and told her, "I stabbed somebody and lit a house on fire." And I'm like, what? How are they going to keep that out? That's like the most important part of this case. It's an actual confession that she said she heard with her own ears. So what did the prosecution really have left? Context, sure, but that's not always enough. On Monday, January 29th of 2024, more than 3 decades after Joy had been killed, Bob Atkins finally went on trial. But here's what's so surprising and why I wanted to talk about this part. He goes ahead and waives his right to a jury. This is definitely a power move by his defense, and I guess they were thinking, oh, you know what? It's great. This is going to have the judge that's wrapped around their finger, they must have thought, rule in our favor twice. Remember, he excluded the April statement. He excluded the Tennessee incident. So now they're thinking, this is all going to hinge on one decision by one man, Judge Wallace Bateman. It's called a bench trial. It's when the judge takes all the evidence into consideration and makes a judgment call, not a jury. But for the Hibbs family, it also meant there was no jury that would maybe connect to this case emotionally. It was going to be evidence, credibility, and logic, and nothing else. The prosecution still had to lay out their case and their theory. It was that Bob Atkins killed Joy inside of her home, set multiple fires to destroy the evidence, and then fled with his family to the Poconos to create an alibi that he relied on for years. The prosecution still calls witnesses. It's everyone that I already told you about. Charlie, Angie, David, and anyone else key to this investigation, from firefighters to paramedics to the medical examiner, neighbors, and even investigators. And the defense argues their case. They say everything is built on rumor and coincidence. They called the Blue Monte Carlo a myth. And they said this photo that the prosecution is relying on from back in 1991, that's not even a car. It's a reflecting light off of a building. I mean, it was a picture that's not digital. They also floated alternative theories, suggesting that Joy could have been killed by someone else. There was a murder that happened out in New Jersey they thought was connected because it involved an arson. But there was something else. They made another strategic move. April Atkins. April was the state's key witness, but because of what had been excluded pre-trial, prosecutors didn't get to put the most damning sentence in front of a judge. Instead, they leaned into what they could: her history of fear, her cooperation later, and that recorded call in December of 2021, where Bob kept repeating his alibi and talking about how, oh, the phone's probably tapped. But here's what I was thinking. This is the same judge that already knew about April's statement, that Bob had come to her that Friday afternoon, told her that he stabbed someone and caused a house fire. He had to take all of that in consideration, and he said, oh, it can't come into a jury. But as they say, you can't unknow it. The bell has been rung. So I thought, was it a better choice to have a bench trial? Because this judge knew that information, whereas a jury wouldn't have. Think about that. Just wrap your brain around it. Jury wouldn't have known. Judge does. Judge Bateman left the bench to review all the evidence one final time. There was just the suspense in that courtroom. 2 hours of suspense. And then he returned. Everyone stood up, and the judge looked directly at Robert Atkins and delivered the sentence that the Hibbs family had waited 33 years to hear. Guilty of first-degree murder. And I was like, yes! I know you're not supposed to cheer. You're not supposed to show any kind of reaction in a courtroom. But if I was there, I don't think I could hold it inside. And there was no dramatic speech because you didn't need one. But the next day, on Tuesday, January 30th of 2024, the judge did hear the victim impact statements. This was the sentencing. And at the end, the judge asked if Bob wanted to make a statement, and he just said no. And that is when Atkins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for arson and related charges. Joy's family chose not to pursue the death penalty, not because they felt merciful towards Bob at all. It was because they thought life without parole was enough. The only outcome that mattered is that that man could never walk free again. But now it was the time for the judge to speak, not just to Bob, but almost to the entire history of this case. He said the Hibbs family had been living the American dream. 2 hardworking parents raising their kids in a neighborhood where they believed they were safe, building a life through effort and love. And he made it clear that Bob stole that in a single act of senseless violence. But what disturbed the judge the most wasn't only the brutality of Joy's death, it was the overwhelming amount of evidence that showed that this system back in 1991 treated this case differently because of a confidential informant. That a man's usefulness to narcotics mattered more than the truth about a murdered woman. Judge Bateman said, whether it was ego or corruption, either way, it was disgusting. And with that, it was case closed. Bob was led away in handcuffs, and that family walked out of the courtroom with something they hadn't been given in 1991. It was accountability. It was proof that Joy's life actually mattered enough for the system to finally care. And just think about it. This caring, loving mom died over a $20 bag of weed. It's senseless. The fact that this monster wasn't locked up so much sooner is part of the reason why this happened. This whole thing is just incomprehensible. It's pointless. So the only way to end this story without giving that pointlessness the last word is to end where Joy actually lived, in those ordinary moments that she made feel special. David, stepping off that bus a little after 1 o'clock on Friday, April 19th, holding his honor roll certificate like a treasure because he knew his mama would be proud of him. The verdict wasn't going to bring Joy back. It didn't give Angie her mom at milestones. It didn't erase David's childhood fear. And it didn't restore the years that Charlie was under suspicion and missing his wife. But it did one thing that matters in a case like this. It put responsibility where it actually belonged. And after 33 years, that truth means so much. I know this was a long one, and this is why I wanted to cover this case because I can't believe that it just got resolved a year ago. It happened all the way back in 1991, just got resolved in 2024. But most of all, I want you to remember Joy. People like her are rare. Her life was full. Her life mattered. She mattered so much that the people who loved her most, the family, never gave up. They refused to let her be forgotten. So I say the same to you. Think about her. And I think I should end there. It's been a long one. Thank you for being here with me. And I will see you in my very next video. Bye.